You're listening to European Startup Universe Talks, a podcast where we meet with startup founders, angel investors, and major stakeholders of the European startup ecosystem. They let us in on the do's and don'ts of running a startup, their career story, and the process of succeeding as well as failing. In other words, everything of interest to startup nerds. European Startup Universe is a massive network of opportunities for EU tech startup founders, connecting them with the best minds of the EU tech community, with unicorn founders, known investors, and experts. We have brought together European countries to join forces and launch startup programs suitable for their nation's tech founders. ESU aims to give access to opportunity for funding and expansion across EU countries. Welcome to European Startup Universe Talks. I'm Maritza, and today I'm here with David Dobrovitsky, the founder and CEO of Glitter Finance. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So could you begin by telling me what is Glitter Finance about?
Sure. Glitter Finance is a high-growth startup within the blockchain cryptocurrency sectors. We're a software company, and with the products that we produce so far is a bidirectional bridge between the blockchains of Algorand and Solana. These are not EVM compatible blockchains, meaning they do not work with Ethereum. They're made of very complex programming languages. In terms of Algorand, it's Teal 5. In terms of Solana, it's Rust. These languages were not created to really work together or communicate. So we created, I would say, a very original product that allows assets to go between the two blockchains. And we're currently the only startup in the blockchain sector that has this product, has this kind of product. Outside of that, we've also created a Solana-based mass token distribution system. It's one of the few ones in existence in Solana. So that's another in-house product we developed. We also developed a Solana token minter, where we basically made the minting of tokens safer on the Solana ecosystem. And then basically we also have a token that's publicly traded called the XGLI. So currently there are 4 products, but we are going to be expanding, adding more blockchain ecosystems to the bridge, and perhaps at some point developing our own blockchain.
As far as I've understood it, you are really working to make the gap, to make it easier for people to use cryptocurrency.
Yes, correct. I mean, that is one of the major overall goals for us. Basically, one of the major problems that we saw with crypto, and by we I mean me and my wife Gail, who co-founded Glitter, was that it was very difficult for normal people to get into crypto. There is a big knowledge threshold. There's also a very big threshold in terms of comfort. I mean, when most normal people see a wallet that's composed of code, people get very stressed and nervous. And then when you add to that the idea that you have to type everything in correctly, you have to be extremely careful. I mean, this really creates a big panic for most people. So one of the things that we really wanted to focus on in creating our products is try to really narrow the gap between what a person needs to know and their comfort zone and their ability to use the product. So to that end, for example, when we were designing the UI of Glitter Finance, I actually told my team, imagine like you're making a toy for a 7-year-old. Like really try not to focus to make this seem like it's a blockchain product or a crypto product. Try to make it literally like a toy, or have the emotional impact of such. And so this is kind of what we're trying to do actively to lessen the difficulty of coming into crypto.
I think that's a great initiative, especially I am definitely belonging in the category of seeing a lot of coding and panicking. So I think that is a great initiative. What would you say is the future of cryptocurrency?
Well, I think that if cryptocurrency has any real future, it's to create a situation for mass adoption. I don't think, and I don't agree with my peers that say that mass adoption can happen through central bank digital currencies. I don't think that that would be a solution. I think that's a different animal altogether. So I think that the only way to move forward is realistically when you take the innovation available in DeFi, and what is DeFi? DeFi is basically the offshoot of cryptocurrency that says anybody can make money at any time, at any place in the world, as long as you understand what you're doing within this particular sector. So if you take that and you somehow are able to translate it into the language of basic end users, and I don't mean basic in a negative way. I mean a soccer mom in Iowa. I mean like a overworked father in Boston. I mean I'm talking normal people. If you're able to bridge that divide of basically connecting these products, these revolutionary monetary products, to normal people, then you are going to have then you're really going to have a future in terms of cryptocurrency. Obviously, innovation within the narrow circle of people that are already in crypto is going to continue. But I think there's always has to be a movement within cryptocurrency that says we're going to take whatever is invented and we're going to connect it to the general public. Okay. And I think that's what creates the future, and that is the future, I
really think that you're onto something, having that mentality. Before you started Glitter Finance, what was your experience as a startup funder?
So I would say that I started in startups from 2015. There were many different startups that I started my hand in. I don't want to go through all of them. Anything from creating like a smart diaper with an app to like creating an app that basically allows for different freelancers to be hired globally. I either was a co-founder or a CBDO, but basically I had a very, very long, lengthy relationship with the startup genre, let's put it this way. And so, actually was so deep that I very often I would work in a corporate job. Let's say I worked in business development for a major global cable manufacturing company, but at the same time, I would also be doing startups. People would reach out to me and ask me to develop them and to, find funding and all of that. So I had a very long foray into startups. And then eventually I got into blockchain.
What would you say is the biggest lesson that you have learned so far about being a startup funder?
The biggest lesson is that the startup needs to be light at the top, and it always has to have an element of magic. Light at the top means very often you make a mistake of creating like a board, bringing in people that you think are really qualified, but from like the executive sphere of business. And so what you end up having is this very top-heavy organization. Very often this happens because founders don't have confidence in what they're doing. And so I think what is necessary is always to understand that the organization needs to be light at the top and just effective enough to make a huge disruption. Because at the end of the day, startup is always about disruption. And you cannot make that disruption if you involve people that come from non-disruptive fields or backgrounds, regardless of what they may achieve in those fields. Okay, for one way or the other. For example, the corporate sector will always be different than the startup sector, and it's always a different type of people that are working within these two different sectors. The other main thing that I learned is that a startup always has to have an element of magic in it. This is the approach to the business. We're not creating, I wanted to say we're not creating McDonald's here, but in reality, if you actually look at the way McDonald's got started, when the restaurant first got started, the restaurant chain, there was an element of magic in what they were doing, because it was in fact a great startup. So it's that kind of feeling of accomplishing something, disrupting, flying, that any startup needs to have. And if it doesn't have it, that's not a startup. That's how you can always tell. So I would say it's these two things.
Okay. Do you have any clues of like hints and leads that a startup has that little magic that you're talking about?
Yeah, first of all, it's how the employees feel in the startup, what the general feeling is, how committed they are to actually accomplishing things. It's also how effective and proactive the startup is. You have sometimes stories where startup starts out, you have a nice website, but you have no product after a year and a half or two. This is a big problem. In my startup, we created the product in under 6 months because everybody was committed. We all knew what we wanted to do. We were extremely involved. That's a startup. So you can always tell what's going on with a startup when you do a little bit of a test to see what the people in the startup are feeling like, how motivated they are. You can tell by what product they put out and how long it takes them to develop their product. What is the actual disruption that the startup is doing, and how motivated are the people behind the startup to create that disruption? All of these things are easy giveaways. Another major giveaway, when you look at the website, okay, the website looks nice, because sometimes when you create a startup, you have a nice feeling, and so you put that into the website. But what story does the startup actually tell you? What actual product do you see from the website? You know what I mean? If there's no discernible product and you're just looking at a pretty page, that's not a startup. That's a really nice idea. So that didn't actually come into a full maturity, and that happens a lot as well. So I would say, if I had to nail it down, I would say a startup is a super effective company that creates things at a much higher pace because of the increased motivation and enthusiasm of the people that are doing it.
I like that capture of what a startup is. I feel like that could be a slogan or some sort. But working as a startup founder, is there any misconceptions that you have seen about being a founder?
My misconception was that I needed somebody to hold me by the hand, and that I needed somebody's approval to actually make the disruption happen, make the product. I would say actually that was my biggest hurdle as a startup founder, and that is also ultimately where my main growth happened. I also obviously kind of had misconceptions about management. These are more technical misconceptions, just about how to manage your staff, how to get the most out of the people. I think I also had a misconception of not always being in balance when I lead. I find now that I'm a bit older and I have gone through multiple startups, that the decision making has to always come from the point of balance. There has to be kind of an equilibrium to what you're doing, and it's extremely important to project to what your desired end result is. So all of these things I didn't start out fully knowing or fully, I would say, being okay with. They weren't ingrained in my mentality. So these are the things that I would say started out as misconceptions and ended being lessons learned.
Mm. And if you were to give some advice to early stage startup founders, what would that be? What would be your greatest advice to them?
Advice for early stage startup founders, I would say always do what makes you happy. That's the number one thing. If it makes you feel like you're flying, you're in the right path. If it doesn't fully click, if there's something that feels like it's a twist, then that's not the right thing. Everything starts with a feeling. All business decisions, regardless of what people say, are based on feeling. Many people want to say, well, I did my analysis and I did my technical analysis and all of that. But then the reality that's not how human beings operate. Everybody operates on feelings. You have your initial impression. You may ignore it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't go away. The decision is already made in the first, half a second. And then you justify it with your mind of why you're doing it this way and why are you doing it that way. And so when you're creating a great product and you're a young startup founder, the initial half a second is really the most important time. And so if it makes you feel like you're flying, you've made it. And if it doesn't, then it's not a good idea to continue.
No. Is that a common mistake you see?
Yeah, it is a common mistake because I think people are not taught to process things correctly within our education systems, Much of our education systems are based on justification, intellectual justification. Well, intellectual justification doesn't get you success, unfortunately. All success comes from feeling. If you feel like you're flying, if you're having fun, then you're much more likely to be successful than if you feel like you have a duty. And in our education systems, we're told that duty is number one. Well, unfortunately, that's not what makes a successful person.
Mm. What are some other mistakes that you often see early stage founders make?
I would say maybe not having an open mind. Not being able to look from the side. Following other people's norms. I mean, these are very common mistakes. They unfortunately really hurt startups. So I would say the biggest one is following other people's norms. Very often you see young people following the norms of 1960 because their parents or their grandparents told them to do something. And so they go to certain schools, they get certain education, and then they bring that attitude into business with them. And basically that mentality has been dead since like 1975, and yet here they are, doing something that doesn't work. And so that's a very common mistake that I see as well. I mean, for example, like a very common example for you is you have to go to university to finish your degree. You have to. Well, why do you have to? I mean, Bill Gates never finished his degree. Steve Jobs never finished his degree. Zuckerberg never finished his degree. Why do you have to finish your degree in a university if you already know what you're doing? But according to an older mentality, you have to. Otherwise, you failed. So this is a very common thing.
Mm. When it comes to getting investment and approaching investors, do you have some do's and don'ts for that?
Absolutely. I would say one of the biggest mistakes anybody makes is mass emailing VCs with their pitch decks. It's a complete waste of time. I've actually heard VCs tell me that they look at inbound traffic or inbound applications as almost like trash. Like they don't even look at it, or if they look at it, they look down on it because it's like, oh, there's somebody coming to me and asking me for something. That's not, you don't want to be in that position as a startup founder. What you want to do is be like, oh, I really want to like have part of that startup. That I want that. You want them to be your customers. You don't want them to be your overlords, basically. And so the best way to do it is you start to network in the industry. You find out people. And by the way, you don't even have to go to conferences for this. I've never been to even one conference. I've met maybe 5 people in the entire industry. And everybody in my startup I recruited remotely. So you don't need to like actually be physically present or even go to accelerators. All of that is nonsense. I mean, it helps, but it's not by any means, by any stretch, is it necessary. So what you need to do is you just need to be in the industry. You need to like work in the industry, take part in projects, get to know people, network. And then, the way that I raised is I simply knew there are certain people. Usually a lot of the investment comes from knowing people in between, people who know the investor and who are scouting for the investors for deal flow. So what you need to do is you need to be in the industry, and you need to have some background where a person can be like, okay, so this person has been in the industry and has done some things. Once you get yourself in the industry and you start to know the consultants that work and create deal flow for investors, then if you develop the relationship, you can approach them, and then they approach their investors. And at that point, it's a very different situation. Because to the investor, it's like, oh, okay, so this is the guy I know that works for me who's bringing me deal flow, right? Or this is the woman that I know who brings me deal flow. Instead of, this is this desperate startup sending me a pitch deck, begging me for money. You don't want to be number two. You want to be number one. You want to be a deal flow situation, not a please give me money situation.
Okay, I think that is some advice that I don't think a lot of people have heard. I think a lot of the maybe mentality is like go and knock on every door.
I mean, listen, the smartest advice is always work smarter, not harder, right? Yeah. You can work very hard, and maybe after knocking on 300 to 400 doors, and having many people reject you and having a lot of negative experiences, maybe you'll get somebody. Or you can just start to work in the industry, get the right networking connections, and then use those connections to indirectly approach VCs in such a way that they don't feel threatened or they don't feel like you're asking for anything. When you start to become deal flow, that's when you have a shot at really getting funding.
Okay, that's super great advice. It has been such a pleasure talking to you today. Before we wrap up, is there anything that you would like to add to the conversation?
No, I really enjoy speaking with you. I'm always open to give advice to people who are starting out. And, in general, creating your own startup is an absolute joy. But there's definitely ways that you can decrease the incredible amount of negativity that you can sometimes get into. And so I'm always open to give advice to somebody who's younger and starting.
That's very generous. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you.
You've been listening to European Startup Universe Talks. If you want to know more about us, go to thestartupuniverse.org and follow us on social media. Thank you for listening.